Summer 2005, suburban Ohio. Police found two murdered men in the bedroom of an ordinary apartment building. Blood was splattered on the walls, and urine and semen were found on the woman's collar. Signs of a struggle and broken furniture suggested a violent outburst. It later emerged that behind their seemingly happy family life lay months of humiliation, abuse, and intimate helplessness, which drove the man to a brutal attack. Alan Reed was born and raised in a small town in Ohio. In 2002, he married Linda Harper, a woman from a nearby neighborhood. The young couple quickly secured a mortgage and moved into a new home on the outskirts of the city, a modest two-story cottage with a small garden. They were considered the epitome of family happiness: stable jobs, good relationships with their relatives, joint outings, and plans for children. However, behind the facade of their respectable life lay details that would later become the source of deep personal drama. The first few months of their marriage didn't arouse any suspicions among family or friends. Alan worked at a local auto repair shop, and Linda found work as an assistant at a dental clinic. They attended parties together, entertained guests, and maintained warm contact with neighbors. No one suspected that an internal crisis had begun to develop almost immediately after the wedding. The main reason was Alan's medical condition, discovered in his youth but never discussed publicly. He was diagnosed with micropenis. The difficulty lay not only in the diagnosis itself, but also in the constant feelings of shame and fear that had plagued him since his teenage years. Before marriage, Alan tried to avoid serious relationships, fearing exposure, and hoped that family life would bring relief. However, her first intimate encounters with Linda revealed that hiding the problem was impossible. At first, she didn't comment on her husband's quirks, but soon hints of dissatisfaction appeared in her behavior. Alan's attempts to smooth things over, to diversify their intimacy, to find a special approach, were met with a cold response. Over time, Linda's attitude became ironic. She began to distance herself, spending more evenings with her friends and taking initiatives less and less. Alan was having a hard time dealing with the changes. His inner tension was mounting. At first, he attributed his wife's cooling to fatigue, stress, and work commitments. But Linda's behavior became increasingly distant. She avoided physical contact, tried not to be alone in the bedroom, and preferred to go to bed late and rise early. Outwardly, she continued to maintain the illusion of a normal family, smiling in photos, talking about the future, discussing their plans together. The relationship began to change on a more personal level too. Linda initiated the idea of sleeping separately, citing the mattress's discomfort. Later, open jokes about male incompetence emerged, first in private conversations, then in front of casual listeners. Alan felt humiliated, but tried not to react. His self-esteem plummeted, and he became increasingly withdrawn, spending his evenings in the garage or going on long walks. Over time, indifference reigned in the relationship. In July 2003, Linda decided to work late, citing a desire to provide for her family. In reality, she was increasingly spending time away from home, socializing with friends, and picking up extra shifts. Alan felt increasingly isolated, deprived of support and respect. By early 2004, psychological pressure had become a part of his daily life. Every casual reproach, sarcastic remark, or demonstrative disdain became a separate blow for Alan. He tried to mend relationships less and less, focusing on work and household chores. Friends and neighbors noticed changes in his mood, but no one knew the real reason. There was no longer any trust within the family. Shared plans disappeared. Conversations became formal. Outwardly, the Reeds remained a normal couple, but all the signs of an internal crisis were evident. It was from this stage that the deep rift began to form that a few years later would lead to the tragic events on Pine Street. By mid-2004, the relationship between Alan and Linda had devolved into a vicious cycle of humiliation and coldness. Linda increasingly rarely initiated intimacy, preferring distance and distance. Even in those rare moments when intimacy did occur, she did so reluctantly, with marked indifference, often displaying irritation with every movement. The lack of genuine contact turned the process into a routine formality, devoid of emotion and even the slightest warmth. Soon, new traits emerged in Linda's behavior. She began to display open disdain for her husband's physical attributes. Her actions became markedly mocking. During intimacy, she would make gestures indicating displeasure and deliberately interrupt the encounter, expressing boredom or sarcasm. Linda often expressed dissatisfaction with Alan's appearance, critically assessing his body. Her attitude toward intimacy became an instrument of additional pressure. Even the hint of intimacy was met with a cold stare or outright indifference. In intimate situations, she resorted to passive aggression. She would suddenly turn away without finishing what she started, or use physical discomfort as an excuse for refusal. She would also leave clear signs of displeasure. She would ostentatiously adjust her underwear, sigh loudly, and then leave the room. Outwardly, all this looked like fatigue or simple bad mood, but for Alan, such moments became a pattern. At the same time, Linda began to change her behavior and appearance. She began devoting more time to grooming herself, buying new clothes, and visiting cosmetologists. Meanwhile, any attempts by Alan to compliment her or support her changes were met with either ignorance or dismissiveness. In private, Linda acted authoritatively, emphasizing her independence, often hinting at her husband's incompetence in various areas, from finances to household chores. Sarcastic gestures became especially noticeable in their intimate life. During contact, Linda allowed herself to make obvious grimaces, suppressed giggles, and sometimes even obvious expressions of boredom or even disgust. She refused to engage in affection, made no secret of her reluctance, and made no attempt to create an atmosphere of privacy. If Alan attempted to initiate a conversation about feelings, Linda withdrew, leaving him alone with his doubts and anxieties. Gradually, intimacy ceased to exist as such. Every attempt at intimacy became a trial for Alan, leaving him with a deep sense of shame and guilt. Instead of support and acceptance, he faced silent reproach, exacerbated by domestic conflicts and cold detachment. Linda perceived any initiative on his part as an unwanted obligation that needed to be completed as quickly as possible. Linda didn't limit her relationship to the bedroom. She indulged in discussions about Alan's quirks with her friends, leaving evidence of these conversations on her phone and social media. Accidentally discovered notes and messages revealed the contemptuous tone in which Linda described her husband, emphasizing his incompetence and childish traits. This only deepened the alienation, creating in Alan a feeling of isolation and constant surveillance. In everyday life, Linda exerted greater control over all aspects of the family's life. She decided when and where to dine, which stores to go to, which movies to watch. Alan's attempts to offer alternatives were nipped in the bud, as were his requests for attention or care. Over time, he became less likely to engage in arguments and increasingly withdrew into himself, spending evenings in the garage or simply driving around aimlessly. Linda's loved ones began to notice changes in her personality. She became more abrupt and stubborn, sometimes openly expressing dissatisfaction with her husband, even among family members. For Alan, each such episode was a reminder of his position in the family. His self-esteem sank lower and lower. By the end of 2004, he had completely lost all initiative, practically stopped showing emotion, and sank into a state of chronic despair. All this time, Linda maintained the outward appearance of a normal family life. They continued to attend social gatherings, take photos, and congratulate each other on holidays. But behind closed doors, the estrangement grew, becoming irreversible. By early 2005, Alan Reed and Linda Harper's family life had devolved into a series of humiliations, hidden conflicts, and silent estrangement. At this time, a new person entered Linda's life, a clinic colleague, 34-year-old Rick Jennings, with a striking appearance and confident demeanor. Their interaction initially seemed professional, but it soon became apparent that a connection had developed between them that transcended professional matters. Linda changed dramatically. She began paying much more attention to her appearance, started staying late after work, and found excuses to leave the house on weekends. Every outing involved choosing outfits, applying makeup, and spending hours in front of the mirror. She appeared at home less and less often and became increasingly cold. Alan watched this process with alarm, unable to change anything or openly resist the changes. Their intimate life ceased entirely. On the rare occasions when Alan attempted to rekindle the relationship, Linda reacted with obvious disgust, emphasizing her reluctance not only to get closer, but even to be in the same room with him. Her behavior became more abusive. She demonstratively refused the slightest attention, ignored any requests for everyday life, and expressed contempt with her gestures and facial expressions. The psychological pressure became pervasive. Linda emphasized her independence, presenting herself to others as an independent and successful woman. She increasingly joked about male weakness among her friends, not hesitating to make overt hints about her personal life, even in front of mutual acquaintances. Over time, Alan developed a persistent feeling that everyone in their circle was aware of his problems. So obvious was Linda's dissatisfaction and detachment. Particularly painful for Alan were the moments when he discovered traces of messages with another man on his wife's phone. The messages had been deleted, but individual notifications, photos, and random names would periodically pop up on the smartphone screen. Later, he noticed that Linda was changing her passwords, even taking her phone to the bathroom, and refusing to answer calls when she was away from home. Any attempts by Alan to find out the reason for these changes were met with an icy response and more sarcasm. Alan lay awake at night, replaying endless scenarios in his head. Thoughts of his wife's betrayal merged with memories of endless humiliation and a sense of his own helplessness. Gradually, he began to monitor Linda, recording her schedule, checking her route to work, analyzing her purchases and receipts. These activities brought no relief. They only increased his anxiety and frustration. In everyday situations, Linda became even more defiant. She insisted that Alan cook, clean, and handle all household chores independently. Her attitude began to resemble that of a strict boss. She issued orders, set rules, and demonstrated disdain for her husband's every action. Even in private, she would demonstratively occupy every space in the room, excluding Alan from even shared belongings. Another form of pressure was domestic punishments. Linda would stop talking to her husband for several days, ignore his presence, and use silence as a tool of pressure. She refused to have dinner with him, ignored holidays, and even didn't wish Alan a happy birthday, preferring to spend the day with colleagues. At the same time, Linda immersed herself in a new relationship. With Rick, she became a different person, liberated, cheerful, and open. This was eloquently evidenced not only by the changes in her appearance, but also by numerous photos found in cloud storage. She visited restaurants, movie theaters, and nightclubs with her new partner, enthusiastically telling her friends about them. These details became available to the investigators later. At the time of the tragedy, Alan only guessed at the true scale of what was happening, but he felt completely isolated and helpless. One night, returning home late, Linda ignored her husband's questions without making any excuses and went straight to the bedroom. From that day on, Alan ceased to be even a formal part of the family. All his attempts to establish contact were met with indifference and outright contempt. On the rare occasions when they were together, Linda ostentatiously went about her business, making no secret of the fact that she no longer cared about anything related to Alan. The final weeks before the tragedy were a period of utter despair for him. He felt like an exile in his own home. Every day brought new humiliations, ridicule, neglect, the demonstrative preference of another man. The internal tension grew to a breaking point, leaving only a bitter sense of loss and hopelessness. In the spring of 2005, the situation in the Reed family reached a breaking point. Alan had completely lost his position as head of the family. The house was filled with indifference and hidden contempt, every action accompanied by silent criticism. Linda stopped hiding her new relationship. Soon, a strange man began appearing in the house, that same Rick Jennings, whose presence was initially explained by the need to discuss work, then by a banal desire to spend time. Alan increasingly returned from work to find strange shoes in the hallway, extra items in the bathroom, and used dishes in the kitchen. The turning point came the evening when Linda openly brought Rick into the house, without even bothering to warn her husband. Alan heard their footsteps, conversations, the sound of running water in the bathroom. Through the thin bedroom wall, he could hear everything in detail, the sounds of the bed, moans, sighs, laughter. He lay motionless on the bed, literally physically aware of his own powerlessness. After their encounter, Alan would enter the room and be confronted with obvious traces of someone else's presence. Rumpled sheets, open condom packages, strange odors, scattered items. He had to clean up the mess himself, collecting used contraceptives, napkins, and other people's glasses. This became a recurring scene, with her husband becoming a servant in his own home. Linda showed no shame whatsoever. She continued to control the home, imposing her rules and openly mocking Alan's attempts to intervene. At the domestic level, the pressure became unbearable. Her husband was given the most humiliating tasks, his decisions were ridiculed, and his opinions were ignored even in small matters. Linda readily shared details of her personal life with friends over the phone, discussing new emotions and experiences, unconcerned that her husband was listening. Alan's psychological degradation was paralleled by a growing internal aggression. He became obsessed with finding out the whole truth about his wife and her lover. At first, these included spontaneous phone checks, then systematic observations of Linda's routine. He recorded her schedule, saved receipts, and noted every movement around the city. Sometimes, Alan would sleep in her car near the house to make sure when and with whom his wife returned. At one point, he even followed Rick, writing down his license plate number and finding out where he lived and worked. Notebooks with notes, CCTV photos, and call and message transcripts began to appear in his life. He studied the movement of funds on the shared bank card, searching for evidence of hotel and restaurant expenses. The more evidence he gathered, the more helpless he felt. None of the collected evidence changed his situation. Linda ignored his accusations and threats, continuing to act as if she were in control. Alan increasingly felt like his existence had become a source of ridicule. Neighbors stopped greeting him, and coworkers at work glanced at him with pity or irony. He sank deeper into alienation, abandoning his old habits, and stopped caring for himself. Inner emptiness gave way to fits of rage. Alone, he smashed objects, tore up photographs, and fell into stupor, sitting for hours in the dark. The final straw came when Alan discovered Linda's forgotten cell phone on his desk. The device's memory contained intimate photos, messages describing encounters, and candid accounts of how much the new relationship had changed her life. Among the messages were direct comparisons emphasizing the advantages of the new partner and comments about how wasting time on an inferior husband was a waste. These words completely destroyed the last vestiges of Alan's self-esteem. At the same time, arguments in the house became more frequent. Linda no longer minced words, openly humiliating her husband even in the presence of strangers. One evening, when Rick slept in their bedroom again, Alan sat in the kitchen all night, listening to every detail of what was happening through the wall. At dawn, he cleared the remains of their celebration from the table, took out the trash, locked himself in the bathroom, and for a long time couldn't muster the strength to leave. Over the next few days, Alan formed a clear plan. He acquired a weapon, a pistol that was kept in his father's house. The preparation took several days. He waited for the right opportunity, studied Linda and Rick's habits, and looked for the moment when he could catch them together. His thoughts were focused on only one thing: putting an end to the humiliation, ridding himself of the feeling of complete uselessness and loneliness. On the eve of the tragedy, Alan checked his notes again, loaded the gun, and hid it in the garage. The last evening passed in silence. Linda and Rick were together again, unaware that her husband was watching them from the next room, recording every sound, every rustle. For Alan, this was the limit of human endurance, the point of no return, beyond which only darkness remained. The morning of June 27, 2005, began with a police call on Pine Street. A neighbor, not expecting Linda to arrive at work, rang the doorbell and, receiving no answer, called emergency services. Officers discovered the bodies of two people inside the house, Linda Harper and Rick Jennings. Both had been shot at point-blank range. Alan Reed sat on the hallway floor, clutching a bloody pistol to his chest, his gaze dull, and his will to resist gone. There was no anger or remorse on his face, only complete indifference to what was happening around him. The crime scene examination left no doubt as to the motive. The bedroom was in disarray. Torn sheets, overturned furniture, condom wrappers, crushed plastic cups, and women's cosmetics mixed with men's socks on the floor. On the nightstand was a smartphone, its screen open to Linda's latest messages, caustic comments, photos from late-night encounters, and more taunts about her husband. Investigators meticulously documented every object, every trace. A pack of wipes, used by Linda and Rick the day before, was also left on the floor. Interviews with neighbors and colleagues quickly revealed the true nature of the Reeds' family relationships. Nearly everyone noted changes in Linda's behavior: her abruptness, a tendency toward demonstrative disdain, frequent visits from a stranger, loud arguments at night, shouting accompanied by mockery and accusations. Some even noticed Linda discussing intimate details of her marriage with her friends, openly expressing her feelings in both her voice and her language. Alan's interrogation in the first hours after his arrest was perfunctory. He confirmed every fact. the humiliation, the abuse, the details of nights when the whole house could hear his wife and her lover. He described how he collected used condoms, cleaned up the aftermath of their celebrations, endured humiliating errands, and became invisible on his own kitchen threshold. More and more details appeared in the records: notebook entries, printed correspondence, recorded expenses for gifts to Linda, and things she bought for Rick. Experts concluded that the accused's mental state before the crime was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but they found no obvious signs of insanity. During the investigation, Linda's correspondence with her friends received special attention. It included ironic remarks about male inadequacy, open accounts of Alan's pathetic situation, and ridicule regarding his appearance and childish traits. Investigators recorded this evidence as evidence of the constant psychological pressure and social humiliation he endured in his final years. The trial began in October 2005. The prosecution presented a full litany of evidence: the murder weapon, telltale signs of a struggle, blood tests, apartment search reports, and numerous testimonies. The defense relied on Alan's testimony, medical reports, expert reports of psychological abuse, and reports of chronic depression and personal trauma. Correspondence was read aloud, humiliating remarks were read aloud, and episodes were noted where Linda forced Alan to clean up after herself and her lover and discussed his intimate details with strangers. Not only the relatives of the victims, but also media representatives were present in the courtroom. The press covered the details of the case with particular interest, emphasizing the phenomenon of victims of family humiliation and the limits of acceptable psychological pressure. Some reports included verbatim quotes from the correspondence, sparking a wave of discussion in local communities. Psychologists brought in by the defense described in detail the development of Alan's persistent inferiority complex, his fading personality, and the impact of systematic humiliation on his psyche. Witnesses, including former colleagues and neighbors, spoke of growing alienation, a domestic hell, isolation, and constant humiliation from his wife. Particular attention was paid to domestic episodes: how Linda forced Alan to wash her clothes after nights with her lover, controlled his finances, and refused any contact except for orders and household errands. The prosecutor, for his part, emphasized that Alan, despite the pressure, understood the consequences of his actions and could have stopped at any moment. The defense cited chronic trauma, a worsening mental disorder, and the debilitating effects of constant humiliation. In December 2005, the court handed down a sentence: a lengthy prison term without parole for premeditated double murder. Public reaction was mixed. Some saw Alan as a weak-willed victim of bullying, others as a dangerous criminal who had failed to cope with a personal crisis. The Reed family's story quickly became a fixture in Ohio's crime news, becoming yet another example of what can happen